Welcome to East and West, a show for helping us keep our spiritual bearings as we navigate this world around us. Wes Young here, and for this finale episode of Season 5, I'd like to read you a short story of mine. It's unpublished, and that makes this an exclusive release, and it's a story that I hope you will enjoy. Stories have a way of contextualizing things, of bringing the disjointed mass of facts together, of making meaning. We've covered a great deal of ground in Season 5, including some very difficult topics, and I think that a story, a narrative, is the best way to wrap all this up. Today's story is entitled Heard Island. I wrote the original drafts 2 years ago, during the infamous year 2020, and I have reworked it several times since then. Before I read it here for this first release, there is an important disclaimer to make. Hear this now. As any writer can tell you, it is a mistake to necessarily suppose a link between a fictional story and the life of the author. C.S. Lewis made this point at length in his book entitled A Personal Heresy, which is actually a written debate between Lewis and a man named Professor E.M.W. Tillyard. But even without getting into Lewis's literary scholarship, the concept can be seen quite easily. Let's take Stephen King as an example. With all his books about crazies and murderers and all manner of evil things, I've heard people say, I've probably said this myself, man, Stephen King must be nuts. But to assume this, based on his fictional works, is to commit Lewis's personal heresy. The truth is, we can't make such an assertion about Stephen King just by reading his fictions. Mightn't the man simply just be creative? Or think of this. A standardized disclaimer is printed, you may have noticed it, at the beginning of most novels. There's one at the beginning of mine. It usually says something to the effect of, this work is fictional, any supposed connection to real people, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. That is exactly my point here. And I give it particular emphasis with this Heard Island story because there are several apparent parallels to my own life which mean nothing, truly. As the disclaimer at the front of novels says, entirely coincidental. Look, creative writers have to draw their material from somewhere. So if they rob a setting for a story from a place that they've actually known in the waking world, as I've done here with Heard Island, what of it? Never, ever, ever use such incidental elements to make the illogical leap that the story must be some sort of representation of the author. Hey, if I set a story in a place that I happen to know, it's simply because I can't realistically set the story in a place that I don't know. I mean, think about it. Having never seen Nebraska, for instance, I am unable to write a Nebraskan tale. Not with any authenticity, anyway. But it goes further than just setting. Another parallel will be when Heard Island's protagonist, a fellow named Jim, gets on his sailboat. People who know me might say, hey, Wes has a sailboat, therefore Jim must be Wes. Wrong again, folks. Way wrong. The reason I give Jim a sailboat is simply because sailing is something I know a little bit about. I could have given him a, hang glider or a harpsichord, but I have no experience with these things, and therefore I can't write about them. Jim is a product of fiction. Period. His adventure is a work of my imagination, that's all. This point you must remember, especially, and maybe why I'm emphasizing it so much, since Jim is not, as you will see in the story, a model human. In fact, his shortcomings are a deliberate part of this story's redemptive themes. Just as it is wrong to think that a fictional story necessarily represents the author, I ought to make another point here that it is an equal mistake, though a very different one, to think that all main characters, what we might call the hero of the story, should be considered worthy role models. That is certainly not always or not even often the case. As with real humanity, some folks are worth emulating, and some are not. And one last thing before we get into it, and this one's on a formatting note. The story Herd Island relies on what's called section breaks. If you were looking at a printed page, you would notice them because there would be white space between where a paragraph leaves off and where the next one picks up. There might even be a squiggly mark or something to really make sure the reader knows, okay, we have jumped in some way. This is a section break. It's almost like a chapter break, though not quite as forceful, I guess. And in this story, the section breaks are used to jump from the present moment when Jim is on the island to the flashback past when he is in Atlanta, and then back and forth again. Obviously, on a podcast reading, you can't see the section breaks, which really could cause some trouble with this story, but no matter. I will depict them audibly. I'll depict the time jumps by using sound effects. Trust me, you'll get it. Beach noises and city noises. You can't miss. All right, enough disclaimers. Enjoy the show. This is a short story entitled Herd Island by Wes Young. Dedicated in memory of Socoria Turner, July 4th, 2020. It was the morning of the third day, and still I had not touched my food. Water, yes, but that was all. I'd never been so long without eating, unless I was sick or something. On 3 occasions over the past decade, I'd fasted for 24 hours, and prayer was all that let me go that long. My supplies, gas station trash food, were neatly arranged in one corner of the tent, unopened. My lantern was dead. I just sprawled there on my mat, sweating, looking out the mesh door to the giant oak tree. The air felt thicker today. Shadowy silhouettes of the leafy canopy showed through the thin roof of my tent. They danced in a gentle early morning sea breeze. In this dark kaleidoscope with its hypnotic rhythm, I slipped into remembering what I came to forget. Uncle Dave was taping bags over the broken window when I got there. The drive across town had taken no time at all. Apparently, even Atlanta traffic laid off after a night like last night. "Hey, Jim, hey!" He tossed down his tape and gave me a tight hug. "It's good to see you." He wore a blue medical mask. His emphysema made him high risk with COVID, and since that mess started, he'd taken no chances. "You too," I said. "This is bad." "Oh, it's all right. We're all right." He bent down and picked up a roll of tape. "Here, help me seal off this window. Smoke's getting in." The smoke was from a car smoldering across the street. My feet crunched on broken glass as I stepped over to help Uncle Dave with his taping. The brick that smashed the window still lay on the ground inside his shop, an ice cream shop, very old-fashioned. Neither of us spoke as we worked. The lights flickered and went off, then came back a few seconds later. We got the window fully sealed by a patchwork of 7 gray trash bags pressed flat and taped together. "You know what's worse," he said. "Lady is missing. The door was open by the time I got downstairs. I reckon she ran off, scared to death, I imagine. Her barking woke me up." He looked at Lady's dog bowl in the corner, a spilt water container beside it. "I'm sure she'll come back." I couldn't respond. I could only stare and seethe. A noise escaped my throat, the start of a word or a string of words, all ripping and hot. I knew Uncle Dave would hate that, especially from me, so I said nothing. He must have caught on. "Let's clean a bit," he said simply. I grabbed a broom. We worked for an hour. I guess it helped. He mostly tinkered behind the counter, broken glass, packs of cones, empty ice cream containers, surrounded by puddles of multicolored milk, spoons, straws, sprinkles, M&Ms, cash. I picked up tipped chairs and overturned tables. One wave of rage caught me just as I lifted a chair, and I nearly slung it right through the bag window we'd just made. Somehow I restrained. What would that prove? A chair through a plastic window. What did last night prove? A brick through a glass one. The chairs finally righted, tables arranged, I asked Uncle Dave if he could help me lift a heavy metal shelf that had overturned. It was as wide as a piano and taller than me. He took one corner and I another. We grunt lifted, and then I saw and yelled and nearly dropped the shelf right back to the floor. "What is it?" he shot out. "Don't look! Do not look!" Lady was there, unmoving. Blood pooled around. A cross shelf had been in line with her head, and it didn't take a veterinarian to know she was gone. Uncle Dave said something, and before I could react, he powered that whole shelf up by himself and knelt down next to his 11-year best friend. That did it. I headed for the door. "Where are you going?" he called after me. "Home." "Home? You just got here." He stepped toward me. "Hey, Jim, it's all right. Really, I'm all right. Come on, stay and help." I loved him. Not that I had much love left for anything. So I stopped. A group walked down the street, right in the middle of the street, flanked on both sides by empty sidewalks. "I gotta get out of here. I'm sorry, I got to." I gave him a tight hug and held on. "You okay? You're not..." He paused. "I mean, you're all right, aren't you?" "I'm sorry about Lady," I said. The fact was I couldn't do this anymore. I walked out. I half dozed, half vegged until noon. I got up again to take a leak, and when I stepped out of my tent, I saw the land bathed in deep shadow. Storm coming. Big one. The clouds were between gray and black, flying inland. The oak's long limbs right over my tent whipped wildly, as did all the lesser trees in this dense wood. I walked up the path toward the riverfront. The tide was high and starting its drop, brown water rushing out to seaward. My boat was well secured and had risen with the floating dock so that the mast was over my head now. Out over the marsh I saw endless shadow and whipping grasses. I wondered if anyone else was on the island. Herd Island, a small strip of land in the Georgia marsh, was for all practical purposes an unpeopled place. Vacation houses stood empty, overlooking the muddy marsh and waiting for their owners to boat over for a visit, perhaps once or twice a year, perhaps every other weekend. The two houses near my dock, that is, the dock I happened to be tied up to, were certainly empty. One was only half built and had been that way for years. The other was half dilapidated, its tall octagonal structure clearly uninhabitable. I considered walking up the dirt path, seeing if any lights were on in the other cabins. I felt very much alone. But no matter, I told myself, this was nothing to panic about, just another coastal storm. I walked onto the dock and stood there a long while, reflecting on how I've always loved that feeling before a summer storm. Something cool and charged about it. Only now it didn't make me feel any better. It did, though, make me feel a bit like eating. That was something, at least. I shuffled back to my tent and gave the sardines a try. Peeling back the sharp lid, I dipped my fingers into the oil. These were sliced. I took them one at a time, crunching bone and all. Then I settled back on my mat to let whatever was coming come. I soon fell asleep, depressed and malnourished. When I woke, the storm had hit. After leaving Uncle Dave's without a clear plan in mind, I went for a drive. I ended up at my house and saw, peeking over the fence from the backyard, an idea. I opened the gate and pulled around to the back. Buster ran out. Sheesh. He licked my hand the whole time I bent, hooking up the sailboat trailer. He nuzzled against my leg, dropped a tennis ball at my feet, picked it up, dropped it again. I had to really force myself to stay angry at this point. But, like most fools who try such, I was successful. I finished with the boat and walked to get my tent and supply bag out of the garage closet. While there, I took my cell phone from my pocket and left it on top of the water heater. Within 15 minutes, I had my blazer and boat in the front yard. I got out to shut the gate. Through the final sliver, just before the gate clicked, I saw Buster sitting within, bolt upright, staring at me, tennis ball in his mouth. I was soon on 675 South. Traffic was light. Occasionally, in fits, I would beat my steering wheel. I was driving just over 90 miles per hour. I didn't know how to feel. In college, I'd met a janitor on a late shift in the science library. She told me about bad spots of her job, mostly about rude people. Then said when those times came, she just sang a praise hymn and went on through. So I tried that. Shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of sin and shame. It might have worked if I'd let it, but despair hates to see itself go. I punched the wheel again and sped on in silence. If a blazer didn't cap at 98, I'd have gone faster. Stupid governor. Of course, my racing south made the gas gauge speed to empty. The last thing I wanted was to be anywhere that involved people, but no way around it. I pulled into a Love's and circled until a pump opened. I knew that to camp where I was planning, I'd need food and drink. But visiting a grocery store only meant another stop, more people. So I decided to go inside the Love's and buy whatever junk they sold there. What difference would it make? I didn't feel like I'd ever eat again anyway. I topped off my tank and headed toward the store. A horn honked behind me. A man leaned out of his car window. "Excuse me," he said. "It's slammed in here. If you're going in, can you pull up and let me have that pump?" His voice was kind, articulate. He wore a tie. I spit on the ground and kept walking. When I came out with an armload of bags, his car was gone. I hit the interstate and my steering wheel again. During the 3-hour drive to the coast, my heart settled into a groove of numbness. The thin walls of the tent curved in. The poles bent and shook. Then the roof cover blew away. There was no point in staying here. Groaning, snapping, thudding timber sounded around me. I thought of the giant oak above. An image of Lady's crushed head flashed in my mind. Yeah, I needed to go. I snatched up the zipper, stepped out, and then shut it. The tree limbs swirled crazily above me. I figured I could take cover in one of the vacant houses by the dock. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, the thunder not long behind it. I jogged. The rain started spitting down as I made my way up the sandy path. I was soon at the dilapidated house and ran up to the rear door. If I had to kick it in, well, at least this house was destined for a bulldozer anyway. A small awning protected me from the increasing rain. I tried the handle. Locked. Then I ventured to the left to check the windows, stepping out from the shelter, accepting the wetness. That was when the dock came into view. My boat was still tied securely, water rushing underneath with the dropping tide. And, I could not believe it, a woman was there. Alone on the swaying dock, rain and lightning and all, dragging a kayak to the edge as though to launch it. "Hey!" I called and ran toward her. She seemed not to hear me. "Hey!" I yelled again, now at the gangplank, which descended to where she stood. She looked at me, kayak handle in one hand, paddle in the other, and no life jacket. A tall and slender black woman, desperation on her face. "Help me here!" I stepped down the plank toward her. "You got to help! She's out there!" I was dumbstruck. "Shania! she wailed. "They're out in this! No phone, I can't call. Do you have a radio?" All of this she gasped out between heaving sobs. "I don't have a radio, no phone neither. They're out in what? Have you seen anyone else on the island?" "Nobody, but I hadn't been walking around. Are they in a boat?" "Kayak, you're the first I've seen. I checked all the houses I could." "And your phone is dead?" "It's on, but there's no signal at all. Not anywhere. I've been all over the island. You don't got a phone?" "No. How long they been gone?" "Her and Frank went out kayaking this morning. They were supposed to be back for lunch, but I ain't seen them since. That storm come on quick." We leaned into the wind as we talked, the rain pelting us. Another streak flashed, this time the thunder coming simultaneously. I felt it in my stomach, and my knees crouched involuntarily. "You're going to look for them?" "I'm going to the marina to try to get help." "Let me take you in my boat." I pointed to my vessel, tied up just alongside where she stood. "That yours? I couldn't get it to crank. I tried." "There's a trick to it." "I'll go get help. You go look for them, can you? Can't you please?" If some state trooper didn't catch me super speeding and take my license, me and my boat and my tent were going to Herd Island. For how long, I didn't know. Maybe for good. Despair makes no plans. Herd was an empty place, and that was what I wanted now more than anything. I owned a single half-acre lot on the island, just an empty square of the forest that some surveyor's map proved was mine. No house, just trees. I went there to tent camp from time to time, me and some friends. Sometimes in my boat, sometimes in one of theirs. There is no bridge to Herd. It always struck me as a strange, lawless place. It's not abandoned, but it feels that way, abandoned and forgotten. That sounded spot on in this moment. I got to the coast around lunch. The marina was crowded. White center console boats pulled this way and that, loaded with coolers, unloaded of fish, hoisted into the river. People bustling, laughing, cussing. This place seemed a world away from the Atlanta streets of this morning. Did they even know what had happened? I pulled in near the ramp and backed my trailer out of the way. My boat was an 18-foot day sailor with a 5-horsepower Johnson. I hadn't bothered to mix any gas, but there was a bit in the tank. Plenty to power me the short distance to Herd. I set up the mast, loaded my tent and provisions, then backed into the water. Within half an hour, I was motoring around the first curve, leaving the marina and the world behind. Was this really happening? The floating dock swayed violently below us. The rain poured down from a darkened sky, and I felt like a man in a dream. Where were the stout fishermen with their center consoles, the Coast Guard, SEATO, the government, for crying out loud? A modern mind cannot grasp something so obvious as the immediate detachment that comes with a loss of cell service. Yet, here we were. "Let's both just take my boat to the marina. This is no time to kayak, and how can I find them in this anyway?" I said, shielding my eyes from the stinging droplets. "No, I can make it. I paddle strong. You got to go look for them. Somebody's got to get looking for them." I thought about the gas, near empty, and the lightning. What happened to a tall metal mast out on open water in an electrical storm? I could die out there, looking for what I had little hope of finding. And I knew I wasn't brave. No, not me. "Which way do you suppose they went?" I asked, stepping off the dock and into my cockpit. "They're probably toward Commodore Island, maybe on the far side in the Doughboy Sound. Sometimes he paddles as far as the Sapelo Lighthouse." Sapelo? Jeez. "They in 2 different kayaks?" "No, same one. She ain't but 7 years old." Jeez again. I fired the motor, then shook the tank. It was terribly light. This was bad. But I was committed, and at least the current was with me heading to Commodore. I strapped on my life jacket and tossed the lady my spare. "Hop on, and I'll at least take you to the river, then we'll split up." Another strike and a loud clap. "Right," she agreed. And with an ease that surprised me, she lifted her small kayak with one arm, and laid it crossways in the cockpit of my boat. She then took her paddle and tossed it in. There was little room left with me and the kayak there, so she hopped on the bow. "Ready to untie?" "Yeah." She deftly unwound the bow line from the dock's cleat, and I the stern. We drifted with the current, racing seaward with the falling tide. I pushed the motor into gear and twisted the throttle wide open. The rain was full force now. Within minutes, we were at the mouth of the small creek where the main river became our forking paths. She to the left toward the marina, me to the right toward the sea, in search of the unfindable. But no point arguing, I knew. She swiftly stepped to the stern, tossed the kayak overboard, and again, with notable skill, took the paddle in one hand and hopped over into her vessel. "Help's coming," she said. "Look sharp. They got flares. Look for those." "Pray," was all I said, and she took to paddling. Strong strokes inland against the current, while I twisted the throttle and chugged away to seaward. The wind over the wires whistled like I'd never heard. It was still a few hours until sunset, but the black cloud cover made an eerie darkness, only broken periodically by flashes of light that I tried not to think about. That and the sideways rain made visibility terrible. I could see what I needed on the boat, but up ahead was guesswork. Once I almost hit a crab trap, and another time the prop ground through a shallow spot. I was zigzagging terribly. I might pass the father and daughter 10 times and not see them. I might, horrible realization, run them over. Plus, if they were as far as Sapelo, the mom might get help and motor past me on a real boat before I did any good. My little motor was giving all it had, but the speed was pitiful. I stood up to see better, stooping to reach the tiller. I let the motor stay centered and steered with the rudder. My body shook. Soon enough, I was at the crossing by Doughboy Island. The rain harder than ever. That was when I saw the first flare, dimly cutting through the wash far ahead, then gone, then back, then gone again. I guessed it came from the eastern tip of Commodore Island, or maybe beyond that, to seaward. This light gave the first real hope I had of finding anybody. Without it, in a storm like this, I'd need lottery-sized luck. But how many flares did they have? If that was the only one, it was not enough. Passing Commodore, I came to where the creek opened up to the wide river, the Doughboy Sound, and I couldn't believe the waves there. I never knew the river could rock like that. I pointed the bow toward the open Atlantic and trudged forward. I shook the gas tank. Bad. I resolved not to check it again. No point anyway. I tilted it toward the pickup tube, stuffing a throw cushion under one side, and left it alone. My clothes were rain-soaked, but the cockpit was self-bilging, so that, at least, wasn't a worry. Light was the main problem, darker by the minute. The ripping wind, too, made more misery. I kept looking for another signal, but saw nothing. Whoever had lit that flare might be anywhere near here, but aside from blinking buoys and markers, I saw no lights. The houses on Doughboy and Commodore were all dark. Perhaps a power outage? Or just no one home. Even the Sapelo lighthouse was dead, or muffled by rain. I shivered hard and wrung the tiller with a crazed grip. Then I saw it. Another flare. Much brighter than before. A constant burn giving me something to aim at. It looked to be midways across the sound. I wondered why they didn't just paddle to shore. As I motored past the shelter of the marshlands, the full, untamed force of the Atlantic hit. To make for the light, I had to go cross-current, and I wasn't sure my boat could take it. The gas, too. No, I shouldn't think of the gas. The main thing was I had a bead on them now. The red-orange glow pierced the dense rain. I was making straight for it, sitting now as my boat tipped madly. Then a wave broke to whitecap just as I was atop the swell. I dropped the tiller and lunged to starboard, clinging to the gunwale as the boat rolled hard. I thought that would capsize me. My mast nearly touched the waves. The motor revved high as its prop lifted out of the water, and then it bogged again as it plunged back down. Then the boat righted, but I was shaken. I knew I couldn't make straight for the mark. I had to angle into these waves, toward the ocean, and then cut back and surf. I dreaded that. Every bad thing that had ever happened to me on a sailboat was when running downwind. Then again, the sails weren't up, so that helped. Still, the thought of cresting and crashing waves hitting me from astern was not appealing. I doubted I could keep enough speed to ride on the backs of the waves. And then the flare died. I turned into the swells and felt the change in the pitch and roll of the boat, harsh but more comforting than the side assault. I realized I should lower the centerboard. It might help a little with stability, and it should be plenty deep here. I snapped it loose and let it fall. With all the wire whistling and wind whipping, I couldn't hear it thud into place, but I just had to take that on faith. A third flare lit, and I saw I had crossed far enough to make the downwind turn. The waves were even steeper here in the center of the sound. Timing was everything. I had to turn just as a wave passed, riding on its back slope. Yes, that, and then the motor sputtered. "No, no, 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 no!" I yelled aloud. It quit. I shook the tank. It lifted like an empty styrofoam cooler. It was gone, and I was adrift in this mess, the rudder dead. I had to raise sail, the absolute last thing I wanted to do. I figured on just the jib, that would give me some steering at least. There was no way I could unbag the mainsail in this storm. The boat was drifting crossways to the waves now and rocking terribly. I expected any moment to roll over like before. I stagger-crawled to the bow and untied the sheets that held the rolled jib. Not bothering to route these ropes around the shrouds, I raced back to the stern and yanked hard. The sail unfurled and went wild, popping like a mad flag. I pulled it to starboard and let it billow out in the chasing wind, snatching the sheet into the cam cleat. The boat shot out like a jet ski. That tiny sail was catching an ocean of wind, and I just did grab the tiller in time. I was on a run now, straight downwind, surfing the swells that rolled in behind. I ripped the fuel line loose without unclipping it and threw the whole tank overboard. It was nothing more than in my way. Having regained a semblance of control, I realized the flare was gone. I needed to see another one, badly. I had lost all sense of my target in the chaos, and I might well be shooting past them and not know it. Maybe I'd passed them already. Then I heard it. Over the whistling of my boat's shrouds, another whistle, shrill, up ahead. It was them. It had to be. I grabbed my dock line, thinking I might get close enough to throw it. I had no idea how to pick up people at this speed, and there was no way to stop or hardly even to slow, unless I came about, head up in the wind, but that would be a nasty turning. Then the whistle again. Closer now. This was it. I rose, tiller in one hand and rope in the other, and then I saw, up ahead, a long, yellow craft right at my bow. I nearly hit it. There was one person aboard, a child, whistle in mouth, blowing wildly. She was crouched, hugging her knees, looking right at me. She had no paddle. I knew a line toss was useless. I threw it down, dropped the tiller, and lunged for the girl. I got a handful of boat, and then a handful of life jacket, and then a handful of child. I snatched her, none too gently, out and over. We fell into the cockpit as the untamed tiller laid hard over and spun us around, crossed to the attacking waves. One lifted us high to its peak, and then broke and washed over the side as we rolled. I clenched the child and grabbed the tiller. The boat righted, and I pulled to try and get us running downwind again. I realized then that the little girl was still blowing away on her whistle. The kayak was gone, falling somewhere behind us. "It's all right, it's all right, it's all right," I tried. She stopped and let the whistle fall from her mouth, dangling on the lanyard that tied it to her vest. She was shivering, wide-eyed, and so small. The boat pitched steeply up and down, but the waves at least weren't crashing over the transom. We were surfing. "I'm Jim! Where's your dad?" She shook her head no. "Your mom sent me. She said you were with your dad. Fred? Frank?" No again. "Shania, right?" "Daddy!" And the sobbing broke out, hard. I pulled her in with my free arm, held her close. She wrapped me tightly. "Brave girl," I said. "Brave girl, you lit the flares?" She nodded. "Brave girl," as I squeezed her close. Finally, she spoke. "He just grabbed his chest," she heaved. "It's all right. You're safe. Did he fall over in the water?" Her face contorted horribly, and she nodded, yes, and collapsed into me again. At that moment, out of the darkened, rain-soaked wail of the storm, a light came on, tall and clear and unmoving. The power must have come back, I guessed. I didn't know or care. All that mattered was that singular light reaching out. "Sapelo," I said. "The lighthouse." "Land?" she breathed. "Yes," I said. "We're going to land. Back to land."